Today, we're doing a breakdown of Microsoft Priva, which if you were not able to attend Microsoft Ignite last month, it was named one of the 6 core pillars of cloud management that they're really focusing on for the next year. Just a reminder, today's webinar is being recorded, and please be sure to drop any questions or comments in the Q&A function within Teams. And Synergy.
Sorry.
Really quick. IT consulting firm headquartered in Richmond, Virginia. We have clients in over 70 countries in all 50 states, and we manage over 3 million licenses of licensing Microsoft 365 through our licensing and managed services practice. If you are new to this webinar, because Adrian and I, my favorite person, really quick, Adrian is one of our best solutions architects. He's had the honor of presenting security and productivity experiences, immersion experiences, and workshops at Microsoft Ignite, as well as conferences all over the globe. And sorry, the whole muted thing really threw me off.
That's okay.
Let's. Good. I know you got a lot of content. Let's get into it. So back to where we.
Sorry. We appreciate the audience participation, letting us know when we've made a mistake.
Absolutely.
All right. So as Christina mentioned, last month, Microsoft Ignite, October 2022, for those of you watching later on, it was. They took the opportunity to align the 6 pillars of their cloud management strategy. And we've talked a lot over the last couple of years around the security in the identity space. And so it was kind of an interesting thing to step back and look at how Microsoft is aligning compliance and privacy, which aligns with the way that they've actually organized the tools in that space over the last 5 years. Not going to cover it in this, but also just in the last couple of weeks or so, Microsoft released a 50-page long privacy thought paper, which was very interesting, covered a lot of grounds, and it really kind of outlines their idea that compliance and privacy kind of go hand in hand, but we're moving into a world where there's going to be a lot more privacy regulations, where we actually have had a lot of traditional compliance regulations. And so the thought is to be more than compliant, and you'll see kind of how that resonates through these tool sets as we go. And we're just gonna keep on having fun technical challenges in here. So what we're gonna do, some of this is gonna look a little bit familiar, right? And some of it is gonna be a little bit of a rehash of space we covered before, but because privacy and compliance are now aligned into a single stack, it makes sense to sort of understand what that stack looks like. And to do that, we kind of have to go back through some of the stuff that we covered in our Purview webinar just a couple of months ago, or a few months ago, which incidentally is at 3,200 views as a webinar, which is crazy. So excited that people are tuning in and getting value from it. But we talked a little bit about the timeline for identity, right? And understanding state and government and organizational roles in managing identity. Well, part of that becomes responsibilities from a compliance perspective too. But then we also layer in the privacy elements of it, which as a concept didn't really exist until around 1950. There was no sense that you were owed any sort of privacy from a governmental perspective until 1950, when the EU had their Convention on Human Rights. We move forward through. Well, we do, right? We actually covered. We covered jewelry in the Bronze Age last time, so we're moving faster this time. So privacy as a concept is relatively new from an organizational government perspective, but it really kicked into serious gear in 2018 with the introduction of GDPR. And we've talked a lot in previous events about GDPR. We have beat that drum half to daggone death. But it's really important because it was a watershed moment, not just in terms of actual practicable and enforceable privacy, but it also really had a technological impact in terms of what Microsoft and other cloud solutions providers began to focus on. So what we saw was a transition from where governments had compliance obligations toward just their governments, right? So governments and organizations have long, held responsibilities back and forth. There's Graham Leach, there's Graham Leach Bliley, there's Sarbox, right? We've done all this compliance stuff over the years, right? But we really have this new concept of individuals as actual stakeholders now in the compliance and privacy space. And what individuals expose to organizations is data, which we expect to be traded on for some value that we perceive to ourselves, right? We also then expect that the organization is going to take that data and offer us some sort of customized and potentially tailored experience for that value, right? You think about the ubiquitous frequent shopper card that we have here in the US, right? Those programs kind of went away or fundamentally transformed in Europe with the introduction of GDPR, because for that card which you put in, you are disclosing all of your previous buying habits, all of your current buying habits, and you're allowing that company to create trend analysis on who you are as a consumer. So, you know, the frequent shopper card allows that company to then target you with very specific tailored ads down the road. And this can actually have some really interesting ramifications, right? Target got themselves into some really interesting hot water years ago. And I've told this story before in advance, where they looked at analytics on a person using their red card, right? And the analytics caused that person to receive an advertisement for prenatal vitamins. Only the particular customer in this case was a teenage girl living at home with her parents. Her parents got very upset, called Target and said, "How dare you identify my daughter as prenatal vitamins?" And they went through and they looked at their analytics and they said, well, based on the, you know, the shopping that we see here, that matches. Target was right. And the girl was actually, in fact, pregnant, but it caused a real problem with understanding the value of data that is made available to organizations and what are the protections and capabilities of a consumer around understanding what that data is and how much data is used. So now we have government stepping in to protect people and their rights to see, modify, delete, and transfer data, and then also hold organizations to account for the way that data is used. And that came into sharp relief just earlier this week, as a matter of fact, when Google reached a $391 million settlement with states over geolocation practices. Google actually had told people that the location tracking had been disabled, where in fact they were still collecting that data and passing it on to advertisers.
I thought you had to opt into Google.
Yeah, you do now. But even then, when they initially said they turned it off, they didn't. What's interesting, though, about this is the first major privacy lawsuit that has cost a substantial amount of money in the US, and it was prosecuted at a state level. All these states got together and created this lawsuit, right? So now what we're starting to see is a number of states with new privacy regulations set to come online either right now or the beginning of next year or as the year unfolds, right? So we've had CCPA, which was an immediate response to GDPR. California has then introduced a new privacy regulation that's set to take effect starting next year that has a different enforcement engine. But Colorado, Connecticut, Utah, and Virginia, if you're here, right, we have a new privacy regulation. Some of these things are going to require an initial investment of your time. Some of them do require a privacy impact assessment. That's a new concept for organizations in the US. We'll get to it, don't worry. Some of these actually have time limits too. For when a user requests information, you are constrained to a certain amount of time to get things done. There are in the EU, all of these regulations are opt-out by default. In the US, they're actually going to be in the EU, they're opt-in by default. In the US, they're opt-out by default. So you will have to exercise some right to be excluded from this content. So it's a fundamental difference here in how privacy is being handled in the US versus how it's being handled overseas. The violation costs will vary differently, and these are these are not caps, these are not limits necessarily, these are ranges that we're seeing here too. And then as these violations are brought up, you will be, as an organization, given a certain amount of time, not just to satisfy the request, but also to cure the problem that got you here in the first place. So there are hard and fast time limits on these. There are requirements for you as an organization to meet certain standards, right? So there's a lot of things that are moving, and they're all very different. And we've been predicting that this would happen for 5 years now. The federal government is actually getting in on the action of trying to figure out whether or not we need to have a federal privacy law. And this is actually being pursued through two different avenues. The FTC is looking at whether or not we need a federal privacy law managed by them. Congress is also separately looking at data privacy laws. So we expect to see a lot of explosive growth in the data privacy space over the next couple of years, which has been really interesting because so far we've really primarily seen explosive growth in the compliance side.
Well, yeah, well, and it's interesting because originally you always like security, Microsoft has always pitched security and compliance separately. There was like security, but now for them to come to say that
it's one of the security workloads,
yeah.
right? Yeah, that wheel of the 6 workloads had security at the center, right? So there's identity, there's device management essentially, and then there's compliance, and privacy.
But they used to, I feel like they used to like market them very separately. Like
they did.
It's for them to come and be like, this is
They did, yes. So so what is a privacy impact assessment, and whose job is it, right? So trying to read your mind right here.
I was gonna say,
yeah. So privacy impact assessments, as defined by the FTC, who are again leading an effort to underscore federal law or create a federal law. Privacy impact assessments are where you, as an organization, look at your data footprint and you figure out what you have. And you do a risk assessment against the vulnerabilities that you would expose through maintaining, storing, collecting, keeping, whatever, potentially identifiable information. So PII, right? Personally identifiable information.
Yeah.
So that impact assessment is going to have information about not just what you have, where you have it. It's going to say, how are you protecting it? What cures do you need to have to meet the new protections, right? What is your vulnerability for legal perspective? It's not just I do business in Virginia. If I also do business in Utah, my privacy impact assessment is going to include looking at both of those sets of regulations, right? So we really need to have a much broader understanding of what we have, where we have it, how we're protecting it, and what we plan to do with it. And as for whose job is it? Well, actually, this is a concept that, again, has pretty solid traction in the EU. In fact, this description comes from the official EU website that defines what is a data protection officer. So a data protection officer is the person under whom all of these things will default, right? So this is not a CISO. This is not necessarily a CIO. This is not necessarily even specifically a compliance officer. This is data protection. So they can all work together, but you might find that there are some things that are not particularly compatible with each other from an ethics perspective. Again, from a compliance perspective, right? Some of these things you cannot actually have a functioning HR member who is also a data protection officer. There's interesting definitions in here. Yeah, if you dig through.
Sorry, I'm reading and looking at.
And I've got the URL down here, so you're welcome to go through, because I know we have a resolution issue with the way that Teams webinars records these. But there are some requirements here that says, okay, so a DPO should not be a controller of processing activities, for example, if they're a head of human resources, right? So there's some real serious challenges around who can have this role and what it's going to mean. But as far as how that person is going to operate, well, that's why we have this new tool set, this new concept of Microsoft Priva, which is going to allow us to identify critical privacy risks and conflicts as part of that initial impact assessment. It's going to then also automate risk mitigation to prevent privacy incidents through some proactive controls and some, again, automations that are built in that we can leverage. And then we're actually going to empower employees to make smart data handling decisions with policies that can show tips back to users to help them engage actively with the protection of data and ensure that, if it is needed, that we're not hindering productivity, that we're able to let users keep on working. So what's really crazy about this is all
Purview.
of this stuff is in
favorite
teeny little tiny entries in the Purview portal. Right down there at the very bottom, where you may never have actually even scrolled all the way down, the entirety of what we're going to do today is inside those two little areas right here.
No one would have. How did they think that was?
Well, and so what's fascinating about this is, as I started to build this thing out, I was really worried this was going to be the shortest webinar we would ever have done.
We thought we were, because very important content, but we were like, let's just fill it.
Yeah, but never fear, right? We will make sure to consume a fair amount of time, and you will be surprised at how much is really in there. So we talk about, whose job is it? What is the name of the responsibility, right? The data protection officer. Well, it turns out there are actually multiple roles that are already built into the Microsoft Purview stack that are designed specifically for handling data subject requests and privacy management. So we can have people operating in cases. We can actually have overall management of these things. We can have people who are able to create data subject requests, and we'll talk about what all those different things mean. But important to note, these are Microsoft Purview roles. They do not surface into Azure Active Directory. I had a very active and amazingly wonderful conversation with some Microsoft engineers about whether or not these were going to be available to add to identity governance packages in AADP2, which we did a big webinar about how that can allow us to build in compatibility groups for roles, right? So it's not there yet, but hold on for that. For right now, these roles exist only in the Microsoft Purview stack. So when we dig down and we look into the privacy risk management space, and we do see that it opens up into a few little areas. The first time you go in and set this guy up, it's going to tell you that it's already automatically gathering insights to help you address your privacy risks. You're not going to have a whole lot of information to surface there, but as it starts to do an assessment of your digital estate, it will come back and you'll start to see more interesting information, right? So you'll see top tiles that'll surface high-level alerts and detection data with key insights across content, policies, privacy vulnerabilities, and subject rights requests in the fields below. Unfortunately, all of that fitting into one screen is very challenging, and it gets to the point where even if I had a 4K resolution on this, you wouldn't be able to see what's there. So we then also have, underneath that, we have a data profile, and this is looking across the storage areas in your digital estate, principally focused on the productivity workloads of Teams, SharePoint, Exchange, and OneDrive, and saying what are the data types that you have in these places, what are the personal data types that we're detecting, and where are these things happening in the globe, because that has pretty significant importance for dealing with global privacy requirements. Now, every one of these areas can be drilled into, right? There's an explore button in here and allows us to dig down into and actually view what these things are. And this is really neat because this is the first time where I've seen that a user mailbox can be explored at the exact same depth as a SharePoint site, at the exact same depth as a team. We have high-level overview of all of these things, and we can dig down into each one of them and see what are the actual contents that are in there that have been tagged. Now, you'll notice up in here, if I can get my mouse to actually work in this space, you'll notice that when we dig into this for this collection of what's inside this one particular SharePoint site, it's going to show us by a specific personal data type, right? And so these are those sensitive information types that we've been leveraging across the rest of the Purview stack for doing data classification and all that kind of fun stuff for a long time. And there are, I think the last time I looked, there were like 260-ish built-in data classification types or personal data types. So there's a whole bunch that's in here. We can actually look at the source of the actual content itself. So if it's a Word document, I could click on source and it'll actually preview the content that's there. It will break out and show me all the specific personal data types that have been detected in this particular file. And then it will also show me information about how the file has progressed over time. So there's a lot that's there, right? So once we know what the data is, we then need to take action and build some policies around how we're managing that. And it comes with pre-packaged policies, right? These three that are over here that are on by default, they come with Priva, they're built in, right? So you're going to see that we have this policy status, they're all on.
How many default templates would you say that Priva comes with right now?
Well, in terms of the policies, it's just these three, but then you can create off the list of things that are over here too, right?
Yeah.
And these are designed for these three principal areas of data overexposure, data transfers, and data minimization. So let's talk about what those mean. I probably should have covered that up right up front. Data overexposure is, you've received somebody's personally identifiable information. It has something about, where they live, what medical conditions they may suffer from. It may even include shoe size. Like legitimately, that's actually included, right?
Yeah.
So if you have received that data on a public form and you're not protecting that form, that data is overexposed.
Okay.
So if you are doing data transfers, well, then that's somebody has taken that information and they have forwarded it on to somebody else to process. Now, those data transfers can be internal only, and we have some really interesting controls that we can exercise around limiting those internal movements. We can actually do cross-border controls, which is really cool too, right? But then data minimization is saying like, okay, so you have my shoe size. You really only needed that to sell me a pair of shoes, and you don't need that 6 months later, right?
Okay.
You don't need it for other information. So data minimization is really about making sure that you're not giving people more data than they need to do the job at hand. And if you are holding on to that data, it does put your organization at risk in a lot of ways. So this becomes really important when we talk about, there are organizations that are designed specifically to weaponize the data that's out there about you as a person. There was I've mentioned it before, but there was a John Oliver special where he actually talked about the data that's floating around out there about you. And there was a company that said with only 6 points of data about a person, they could actually identify they could identify and de-anonymize a person off of a medical mailing list and recognize that somebody in a specific region had a specific disease simply because they had been targeted by XYZ number of communications. And they actually, in the video, they specifically found and identified a cancer patient based simply on publicly available data about survey content that they had done. It was wild, right? So minimizing that data is something that's going to be very important as you start looking at what data you have available about people.
Well, and the expiration dates too. Like I feel like so many companies, it's like I may have needed your shoe size or someone for a gift like a year ago, and I don't even know I have it. But then if there's an organization that have, like it just not knowing,
Yeah, so being able to create these policies and assess against our existing environment becomes really important. And when we start looking at what it looks like to dig into these default policies, and again, this is a scroll bar that goes way down off the page, but we're looking automatically for all of these built-in sensitive information types, right? We talk about looking for obsolete personal data that can be minimized in your organization, right? So it's by default, it's already looking for stuff that hasn't been used in 30 days. And you can manage these thresholds. You can go in and tweak them to whatever your heart's desire. Now, again, we talk about empowering the employees too, right? So we've got a data protection officer who's looking at this content. We have policies that are going out and making the automated side. Remember, we had the 3 pillars, right? The identify, automate, and empower. Well, now we can also then surface controls out to our users so that as they are working with content that has privacy issues, they can decide what to do with it in place. And that's going to extend to messages. It's going to extend to Teams messages. You can see right here, by default, the system is going to block. But as a user, you can say, hey, this is actually critical to this business process. I want to override this, right? And I want to actually make sure that this gets sent on to the person I'm trying to share.
Social security numbers?
Yeah, you know what? I mean, there are exemptions and exceptions in all of these pending regulations that allow you to comply with other controls. So if you are an organization that has to deal with HIPAA, the assumption is that you're going to build your teams in a way that has protection enabled by default, and that you're going to be leveraging those protections, and therefore you're going to want to override this.
Does that work in not across organizations, but roles as well? So for example, like HR, if they were like, I'm just thinking about Social Security, like Sharon, if they were dealing with this kind of data, can you regulate like how that data is shared?
There's a lot of controls around who gets covered and what happens to it. So we'll get into that in a moment here too. All right, and then so again, we have lots of privacy controls, right? So what's really interesting too is that in order to get those things surfaced to the users, you really just come into the privacy management overview, click on recommended actions, which is right here under get started, and it surfaces these controls right here. So recommended actions to empower your workforce are pre-surfaced into the tool set. You just come down here, hit apply settings, and users start benefiting from them. So it's super duper easy to empower the users. Now,
I love empowering people.
Yeah, you just click the button, right? I mean, it's great.
Yeah.
One of the other things that's really interesting too, as we start looking into privacy controls, and this actually is a component of this tool set, but you'll start to see it in other places in the Microsoft stack as well, is this ability to bring in our data and actually exercise our controls over it pre-anonymized, right? So
No,
yeah,
pretty
exactly.
anonymized,
This
guys,
is this is
pretty
really interesting too, because and you'll see this as we get through here. When
Mhm.
we start collecting this information about our users, about our customers, and we start acting over it, well, one of the things you're going to start doing is putting notes in the fields about what you're detecting. Well, that data can then also become PII. So as we're collecting this data and trying to figure out what is the privacy impact, we probably don't actually want to expose to our administrators who this data pertains to, because that in itself can be a data overexposure. So we need safeguards as we bring that data in. This is also supported in Microsoft Defender for cloud apps, which we see, people in our organizations working with cloud apps, and we want to make sure that we know what they're using. We may not be so super concerned about who specifically is using it so much as we want trends and analysis of what's being done. So we're starting to see this anonymization capability that's coming across a number of the Microsoft platforms too. But again, this is also now baked into Priva. All right, so the other half of Priva, aside from privacy management,
Purview, we're
is
back.
also, well, hold on, is also the subject rights requests. So we're still down here in the bottom corner, right? We've done privacy risk management, but now we're moving into the subject rights requests. These are the part where the user has the authority to exercise control over what you have about them. They can ask for a data access request of what do you know. They can do a transfer. They can say, give my organization to, or your organizational data about me to this other organization. They can request the copy of it, or they can request the right to be forgotten. Now, these are not new concepts in the EU, but they are new concepts in the US. Yeah. And what's interesting is that in the old protection.office.com, you had the ability to assemble some of the components to do this. But you really couldn't do a whole lot with it after you'd gotten the information, right? So this whole tool set now automates the process of collecting the information, reviewing the information, and then deciding what to do with it. What is the disposition of the information afterward? And you'll notice I mentioned in these pending state regulations that a lot of them have time restrictions on them. Well, this actually is surfacing the information about our time restrictions. What's new, what's overdue, right? How are we seeing these requests coming in? What's active? All this kind of fun stuff. And again, importantly, and we'll talk about this a little bit later on, how many subject rights requests do you have left in your license stack? So that's going to be kind of interesting. Oh yeah, we'll get to that. Yeah. Now,
I feel like I keep asking questions and he's like,
that's all right. We're going to get to all of it, right? So
we're getting to all of it.
What's neat here too is for every single subject rights request I create, I can actually automatically create a team out of it. And that's fascinating too, because as I start to bring in more collaborators to work on this subject rights request, I may need to actually work directly with people. Well, as I add collaborators to the case, they become collaborators in a team. And this is actually identical to what we saw in the Sentinel webinar a while back. And here's the team that was created in the Sentinel webinar, where as an incident response, we were able to say, click create a team in Teams. Well, now Purview's data subject rights requests actually do the exact same thing. And you can see how these are surfaced. And yes, I did run a service request against myself twice because I messed up the first time. But again, you see that surface to me right here. Absolutely. Yeah. Well, I threw some silly information at it. So then we can go in and decide that the default classifiers are not sufficient for our job. We can actually upload our own personal data management schema, information that we know that we collect. If it's shoe sizes, right? We can collect that as a schema. We can then build onto that schema with sensitive information types that are specific to us. And then we can actually take personal data that we know would match it, upload it, and have it verify that it matches the results that are expected out of this tool set. And there's a lot of stuff that's in here too, right? We can define what our schema fields are, principal field names, and we can do all kinds of really fascinating stuff with this. So if your 260 some odd built-in ones aren't doing it for you, you can get very granular in a hurry. And then once you've got that uploaded and created, then you can start creating your subject rights requests. Now, these can be templated. There are templated deployments for these, but I will caution you.
Can be, as in they don't, are there options to come templated?
Yes.
Okay.
The templated deployment in its current iteration defaults to only searching SharePoint. And that may be fine. But when you create a request, when you hit that create button right down there, you consume a license. And you cannot then go back and change where it's searching. So the templates are a great start, but I would caution that if you want to do some information assessments against, what you have where, if you're doing a data subject rights request and you want to check against Exchange Online as well, you're not going to use the templated deployment. You're going to do a custom deployment. So what's really cool here too is having gone through all of this and pulled all of these settings in here too.
Yeah.
You can actually get extremely granular. You can feed in that a user has multiple email addresses. You can feed in that a user has multiple phone numbers. You can feed in multiple versions of the way their name is spelled, right? You can do all kinds of information. You can set date ranges on it. You can include information that user themselves created versus information that was created about them inside the organization. So you can pre-target all this information and get very specific about what you find. Yeah. And including version history of the content that you find too. You can decide that you want to target this down to specific mailboxes, or you can do Exchange Online as a whole. What's interesting here, though, is that while it doesn't say Teams here, it is actually searching Teams, because remember, Teams is a part of SharePoint, right? And that also means then OneDrive as well. So once we're ready to hit go on this, we create the request. The request goes into the queue. We can start to see it doing information about, we're telling you, when it was requested, what's the deadline, because you can define that too, right? Remember, all of our pending litigate or privacy rights laws are going to say 45 days by default with a 45-day extension period available, and then 30 days to cure. So we're going to, by default, have 45 days on this. I've made it a little bit shorter for mine. We can also associate this with a privacy regulation. So when I did this, I think the first time I associated it with GDPR, so you'll see that in the list there. This time I just chose not to. You're going to see more of these come online over time. And then we move through a tree of progress, right? And it's going to tell you the number of items that it found. You'll be able to go and do a data collection review, take notes, add collaborators, get a report, and then also you can chat with collaborators right here out of the actual rights request. You can import files too if there are content that needs to be associated with this request, but it's maybe not in your Microsoft 365 tenancy. Exactly, yeah. Or maybe you have a server on premises where you have old data that needs to be assessed, right? And then you'll notice that this is starting to pop up in a lot more of the online workloads. We actually have these native integrations with Power Automate beginning to surface directly into our cloud management workloads. And again, I said I would have it over Christina's head, but what I really meant was way up in the top corner. We will make sure to reference back to Jeff Lau's Power Automate webinar, where he talks a lot about how to do some of these advanced integrations. But as we dig through here, right, we get into the data collected space, and this is a very thorough list of all the content that was pulled back that maybe includes my name, those phone numbers, those email addresses, any of it is in here. And there's actually a built-in redaction tool right here too. So as I start to look through here, I can see that, and I sent a request to purchase a Sklibber to bits or whatever it is. I put medical information that I was proceeding with treatment for gout and heading to my vacation home in Vermont, right? But you can see that this information. You're really into this. Yeah, I wanted to trigger a bunch of alerts, right? And then Annemiek forwarded it inside the organization to lots of people so that they could all enjoy this. Well, I was able to come in here as the case owner, annotate right here in place with the redaction tool, and I can actually set that, there should be pictures drawn over this, do anything I want to. I can take notes on it. I can apply tags to it too. So those tags can include follow-up information. If you're doing a delete request, there's actually a delete tag, I think, that's available, and you have like 20 some custom tags. You can decide what you want to do with the content that you find. Then you're gonna, actually, wait, let me go back here, hold on. You can decide you want to include specifically some of this data, exclude some of this data, decide it's not a match. You can do the tagging at scale, right? So there's a lot of content, a lot of capabilities for deciding what gets included. And again, the DPO, the data protection officer, is going to have some work here to do with deciding what all gets included in this. But then once it's complete, you're going to get these reports. Now, by default, while the process is running, you're going to get the reports for internal use. And when you download these do not include the actual files. This is just a listing of the content that was found and why it was found. But then once you complete the review, you'll actually be able to come here and pull the export package. And this is where we get that ability to do the data transfer, the data export, or up to and including the data deletion. And these are capabilities that did not exist at all in the previous iterations. And this is why, if you're thinking, well, I could have done all this through eDiscovery, you can't. You can get the information, you can't redact it in place, and you can't do the export, transfer, or deletion.
And that's huge because, so data, like it would, depending on where, like it deleted just across the.
Yeah, so we'll get into, there's some challenges around deletions as well, because that is brand spanky new. In fact, right here on this thing, this was introduced in preview last week.
Oh, wow, we really are on top of it.
We are right on top of things, right? 11/9/2022 is when the KB article was, or the Learn document was published. And that does put us a week ago, 8 days ago, was when we got delete in public preview. Deletions are the invocation of the right to be forgotten if you're using the GDPR language. But I mean, there are some interesting manual controls around what has to happen for a deletion to happen, because you're not just looking at the data and moving it around. You're actually creating a new process. And what's interesting about that process is that it introduces an approval state, right? So if we're just doing what do you know about me, that doesn't require an approval state. So as we introduce these approvers, there's additional roles that have to be added in your Purview stack, in your permission space. And we covered what those were earlier, so I won't drain that information here too. But it does add some additional steps, and there are some additional rights that have to go into it. So I mentioned also.
I am really good at like calling out before deleting. Let's talk about
so I mentioned earlier that deleting is obviously brand new, and I also mentioned that when you're looking at your subject rights requests, the first number that it shows you is how many you have left. Now, a deletion is going to be a data subject rights request. However, as it says right here, during the let's see, it won't count against your purchase subject rights request during the preview.
Oh.
Yeah. So it also, I want to call out here, and the reason why I don't usually like to go super heavy on screenshotting documentation, but delete requests are not yet available for GCC and GCC high. So and there are some interesting limitations on geographies as well outside the US, where just some of these things or even Priva itself may not exist. So we'll try to cover a little bit of that as well, but that's in online documentation. So we have covered a lot of ground, and obviously the question becomes, how do I license it and what do I do with it? Well, Priva is broken into two separate licensing vehicles. The first is Priva Privacy Risk Management, which is an add-on license for users at $5 a month. In order to qualify for it, you have to have an active Office or Microsoft 365 subscription.
Doesn't matter what SKU, like E1, E3, E5.
I don't believe it does. I don't believe it does. I would always default to E3 and above, but the other side of that then is the data subject rights requests themselves, which can be purchased in bundles. Now, as a trial environment, you get a 50 pack, but when you go back to buy them later, they come in 1, 10, and 100. You'll see that it says from 16 whatever per month, but realistically the cost is simply $20 a month. There is no particular savings for doing these in bundles. And these are pulled at a tenant level, right? But what's also interesting is you get 12 months from the date of purchase to use them. So if you only think you'll be doing a few, don't overbuy, because they will expire, right? They don't just sit around and wait forever. They will expire. You get 12 months from the date of purchase. But they're pulled at the tenant level, and they're not associated with a user, right? So this side of things does not depend on being tied to an active Office or Microsoft 365 subscription. This is its own standalone license specific to doing the data subject requests. Now, you do not need these to do the impact assessment. You don't need these to understand your data profile. You need these to do the data subject rights requests.
Wait, that's important.
Yes, it is. It's critical to understand the difference. Yeah. So now the questions, right?
Okay, yeah, I was gonna say, I realized like halfway through I should have just stopped talking, because everything I asked we were gonna get to later.
I try to be a little thorough with these.
I know, I like it. Okay, so eDiscovery, we I know there was you and I talked previously, and there was like a huge topic around eDiscovery that you want to talk about.
There was, and I spoke to it a little bit too. And that the question, if I'm reading it right, is why can't you just do all of this with an eDiscovery license? And obviously, the data subject requests that just you can't, right? You can't do the export, the transfer, the deletion. But you know, we if you watch Microsoft's introduction to Priva webinar or video, Vasu Jakal introduced Priva at Ignite in 2021. And part of the pitch then was a little bit around, you could do all of these things, but this is a single tool. Well, even doing all of those things with multiple tools in the default stacks that we had available was a little ham-fisted, right? The role assignments were not going to be correct. So you might accidentally end up over privileging users that don't need to have full legal capabilities in your organization.
Yeah, we're talking about compliance. That's a big issue.
Exactly. So as a compliance workload, right, it has some natural incompatibilities. Then you also get into there's different licensing requirements that may become more permanent, may become less permanent. It muddies the water a little bit to use those tools to do this. But again, when you start looking at having to do these privacy assessments, this tool set's just designed to do that, right? So yes, you could ham-fist your way through doing all of these things other ways. Yes, I won't tell you can't, because you can.
But save yourself the time and energy and don't.
You will end up with overprivileged users having access to too much data with, unless you're doing the advanced eDiscovery, I don't believe you get the in-place redaction capabilities. And part of what you are going to be doing as your policies evolve over time is actually demonstrating that redacted content. So again, yes, you can, maybe no, you shouldn't do it with other tools. This is intended to be an easy button for privacy. And you know, as we see more of these rules come into play, we'll see templates created in the Priva space designed specifically for those regulations.
It's like the tech version of do as I say, not as I do. So speaking of the assessments, so we were talking about the data import. So what third-party data can be imported and why?
So I showed in the schema matching that you can import custom data, but I also showed in the policies or in the data subject rights request, you can actually import content as well. And the thought there is that you may have data that lives on a file server or in some other cloud repository, on premises in some mechanism. You can ingest that content to be assessed as part of the data subject rights request and then decide whether or not you're going to take action over it or not. Once you do that, that content gets put into Azure Blob Storage. Yeah, and it's protected with the actual data subject right request. So everything gets put together in a single pooled repository.
Oh, okay. Sorry, the word blob.
Yeah, Azure Blob Storage.
Well, I was gonna say, we have super technical terms for it, and you said blob, and I was like,
yeah, that is the technical term, unfortunately.
Actually, I love that though. So is Priva available globally?
Yes-ish. There are some regions. There's actually a list of like 12 different countries and regions on the Priva documentation page where it says that if you can't find it in your portal, it's because it simply doesn't exist for you. But the lion's share of the planet can leverage Priva.
Okay.
Yeah.
Interesting. And okay, so this next one. What types of analytics and trends are available in Priva?
So those are actually all built into the default views. So, and again, my tenant doesn't have a whole lot of live data. Otherwise, I would have loved to be doing a live demo rather than slides.
Yeah.
But all of the trend analysis information is in there, right? You'll see in the overview under privacy or data privacy management, you'll see actually like top information types that are stored and where there are. You'll be able to look at geographies. You'll be able to get information about redactions over time. All of that is inside of its own view. What I haven't seen yet, so you can do shares and you can do exports of content. What I haven't seen yet, and that doesn't mean it doesn't exist, I just haven't dug deep enough for it, is integrations into like modeling engines like Power BI. I have not seen that. It doesn't mean it doesn't exist.
You and Jeff, I would love to see. That would be a great idea. We'll dig into that. And speaking of analytics and trend reports, I finally get to say it once on this webinar because Viva, we'll talk about it later, but that was Viva. I always think of analytics. I just want to say ones. Okay. We got a couple more. So does Priva offer templates? So we've gone through
Yes.
some.
Yes, and we looked at that under the policies. You get the
Mhm.
predefined 3 templates, and
Yeah.
actually, as you decide to create new policies, you're going to have 4 sections, and those are pre-templated to match the overexposure, data minimization, and data transfer policies. And again, even though they already exist in real, they're already there by default, you can actually templatize much more granular and much more tailored deployments. However, you can also get in and do a full custom policy that's as granular as you want it to be down any path. Yeah, and the same is true around the data subject requests. They are templated by default, but I ran into a little bit of challenge with it wanting to keep me all in SharePoint, and I really wanted to do an assessment against Exchange Online as well. So there are templates. Understand what they mean before you consume licenses with them. Again,
yeah, that's because we talked about.
Yeah, so that the nice thing about the trial licensing for the data subject requests is that it's a bundle of 50, so you have some guardrails and some room to kind of work through the kinks.
Got it. And then let's see, can Priva integrate with other Microsoft solutions? I feel like yes.
So yeah, and again, I chased down this path with Microsoft engineers around the roles surfacing up into Azure Active Directory and privileged identity management, and that integration doesn't exist yet. However, it does consume the sensitive information types that exist across the rest of Purview. So Purview itself, yes, it's fully integrated into the Purview stack.
Right.
But as far as abstracting roles, like creating something like a data protection officer as an access package in Azure Active Directory and assigning the right rights to that, that's not there yet. But we do believe that is coming.
PII, big thing. So how does Priva ensure that PII is kept safe? That's like
well, that's sort of up to you, right? We can identify using Priva, an administrator or a DPO can detect what data is where and then decide what to do with it. Then you are relying on a lot of additional technologies. You might be relying on sensitivity labels, another Purview workload, right? You might be relying on those sensitivity labels integrations with other workloads like Teams and SharePoint and all that kind of fun stuff. So it's not out of the box going to just make your life better, but again, you will be able to do your impact assessments. You'll be able to empower your users to decide retention as a certainly, because that's a critical element of data privacy as well. So you as an administrator will have to decide what those protections look like and how to surface those controls to the users. But once done, the empowerment was literally a click of a button.
Well, actually, and that's a perfect lead into the next question. We were talking about privacy impact assessments. How do those work? So obviously like hybrid work, BYOD, like stuff. So mobile devices, phone, like how, in terms of how much data, if you're running one on an individual, how can you regulate whether, so because personal data versus corporate data, like is there a,
so
I feel like that's a big.
First of all, privacy impact assessment is going to be a global footprint look. It's not going to be looking at any one particular user, right? And again, you can anonymize that information as you bring it in. That's all right. So data subject request is where you actually saying, what do you know about me?
Sorry.
Yeah. But as a privacy impact, you will be assessing some of the information that would be found in a data subject request. You're just trying to get a global understanding of what all you have and what are your protections around it and what are your risks and vulnerabilities.
Okay. I hope that answered that question because I'm learning again, as usual, just as much as y'all are.
Yeah, and actually one more thing too about the difference between eDiscovery and a data subject request. When you produce an eDiscovery report for somebody, you're actually putting all of that content into a PST file, but you're not removing it from where it came from. And that's a critical thing to understand. So when you do an eDiscovery, if I do one against Christina and I want to know all the email and all the content she's created, I'm leaving the original files in place. I'm just pulling a copy of all those into a PST to then deliver to a legal team. So that's great, but it's one touch and done, right? And I have a record of where the content came from, but when I'm actually doing a data subject request for export, transfer, or deletion, I'm pulling all of those into a single export package, which is a zip file, and I'm removing it from where it came from originally.
Oh.
So it is not copy, it is move.
Wow, wait, that is really important.
Yeah, that's
I
a
did not-
critical
that's-
distinction between
Yeah.
eDiscovery and Priva, or specifically data subject requests.
Everyone write that down. I'm making amendments. Like, no, I'm not kidding. That's huge. Okay, and then again, I'm gonna mess up so privacy impact assessment and then the data subject request. If you do not, so for example, in the tenant, when you were testing this, you ran a report on yourself. If you do not invite a collaborator, who else has access to
The privacy rights administrator can open all the active cases, and then the creator of the specific request has access to it.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then
And this is different again from the way that advanced eDiscovery works, where you're actually bringing in, I can't remember the terminology, but you have case collaborators in that sense, where you have case owners. And again, the terminology escapes me, but again, if you use those engines to do this, you end up with over provisioned users.
Okay. So okay, and those were, and I know, sorry, that was a lot of questions. Thank
Yeah,
you.
hey,
That was
that-
honestly, that was like,
yeah.
that was spitfire. Way to come with that. So if anyone else has any more questions they want to drop in the chat, please do really quick. And then while you're at it, thank you so much for attending today's webinar. You will receive a follow-up email by tomorrow with the recording. And then in the future, please be sure to keep up with us on social media, events page, subscribe to our YouTube channel where Adrian, literally we're living and breathing YouTube right now. We have so much great content out there. And then I promised Adrian I was not going to do this on this webinar. I did, but so next month.
Mute.
Next month, we're doing a webinar on Microsoft Viva.
Yes.
And I named it Live in the Microsoft Viva.
Oh no.
I did. I told him I wasn't going to say it. I was going to embarrass him. But yes, so which it's not security related, but they rhyme, but it's, you know, the productivity version of it's like community and corporate engagement, and
there's a lot.
There's a lot.
And you know what?
I'm
It's
gonna
bigger
start
than me,
saying that.
in fact. So we're actually going to have a guest who's going to join us.
Yes, the fireside
Yes,
chat.
we're going to do a very fundamentally different
Yes.
format from this. No big blue background, I don't think.
I don't even know if I'll
I
be
don't
on
think.
it. I mean, yeah.
We'll just light a fire in here.
Am I included, or
I
is
don't know.
it?
Do you have a ticket?
I'm the one who made. Yeah, so we're doing a fireside. So Dan Finn, our vice president of sales, will be sitting in on a fireside chat with Adrian, and he loves Viva, and I think especially for sales, as they're like they get all their analytic reports on how
There's
much
a whole Viva
There's just
sales component that exists too.
So that will be next month, and I will also include the registration page for that in the follow-up email with the recording to this webinar. But is live in them. I keep wanting to sing that song so badly.
I can't reach the end webinar button from here, so
He can't. That's
sorry.
why I'm in charge. But so with that being said, I'm not seeing any more questions in the chat, but thank you again so much for joining us, and thank you, Adrian, as always. I know that was a lot of content for.
Yeah, there is for
that
two
was-
little teeny tiny
for two-
buttons at the bottom
for two
corner of
buttons, we
Purview.
talked
There's a
about
lot.
Yeah. Halfway through, I was like, Christina, just stop asking questions, because every time you do, it's either he says I'll get to it, or it just I feel like I'll ask it later. But yeah, thank you everyone for joining us. Happy Thursday. And Viva, register. I'll send you the link. But thank you everyone, and have a great rest of your day.
Bye.